Joining me to discuss this is Keith Carmichael. He's the Missouri Director for the Convention of the States Project. He's a business owner from West Central Missouri. He says this will be the most important governing event in our lifetime. Keith Carmichael, welcome to KMOX.
Glad to be with you, John.
So let's start with Article 5 of the Constitution. What does it allow the citizenry to do?
You know, I have to admit that I wasn't aware what was in Article 5. You mentioned a civics lesson. That's exactly what we all need. And I got one last year and just looking for a solution. And Article 5, I couldn't have told you much about it a year ago. Maybe it's after 4 and before 6. But it's the part of our Constitution that allows for amendments. And when they started the process of writing the Constitution, that's one of the very first things they did. They realized that what they did was not going to be perfect, and they started a process by which it could be amended. It has two parts, and most of us are very well aware that we've had 27 amendments in our country's history, all proposed by Congress. The second half of that is a part that's never been used, and which allows states, two-thirds of the states, to call for a meeting, get together, and make proposals for amendments to the U.S. Constitution. It's really the rudder that's been hidden in the Constitution. It's kind of the rudder that we've never used, and maybe the reason we're way off course.
And tactically, how does it work? So two-thirds of the state legislatures would have to call for this convention of states, and then they would go about selecting delegates. Is that how that works?
It is exactly. That's the first step. Obviously, I wasn't aware that there was 34. There's been 34 conventions, not Article 5 conventions, but conventions the way the framers understood them. 22 before the founding, 11 since the founding, in which they followed the same basic rules. And we wouldn't be talking about this today if it wasn't for this one small fact, John. Every state gets one vote. Missouri gets one vote. Wyoming gets one vote. California gets one vote. So this allows the states to come together, each one being a sovereign state and having a say. You know, we call the Supreme Court, we think of it as the supreme law of the land. Actually, the supreme power, as subscribed in the United States Constitution, is the state legislatures working in unison.
And so you're going to have someone in Missouri is going to offer this as a proposal this year. Have you all identified a sponsor in the state of Missouri in the legislature?
Absolutely. You know, last session we got quite a ways. It actually came in the House, was sponsored by Mike Moon, and went all the way to general laws, went to committee, came out of committee. We just kind of ran out of time. We didn't have a plan, really didn't have much of an organization. This year it's going to be a resolution. It's not a bill, but it's actually a resolution. Doesn't require the signature of the governor. It's going to be sponsored in the House. Really, we're going to do it in two resolutions, one sponsored again by Mike Moon, and also Eric Burleson is also going to be sponsoring a very similar resolution, if not identical, with the idea of bringing that together later on in committee.
And what are some of the issues that you and your organization hope would be addressed if we had this convention of states?
That's a great question because, you know, there's been 400 calls for conventions in our country's history, and it's never happened because these calls must be in agreement. And so they have to be at least on one topic. And the topic for the Convention of States project, the one we're working towards, the one this resolution in Missouri will call for, is a resolution to call for an Article 5 Convention of States for the purpose of restraining the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. There are things that would fit, things that would not fit, but obviously term limits, obviously balanced budget amendment, state repeal amendment, for example, giving states the ability to repeal things that might come out of Washington. Those are the kind of things that would restrain the power and jurisdiction of the federal government.
So there are some opponents of this thing that would say once you open up the Constitution, it's a whole can of worms and anything could happen. Your point is that the topic area is restricted to just those kinds of issues.
Sure, and that's exactly right. You know, the one reason that we haven't had a convention of states, even though there have been hundreds of calls, is that they must be in agreement, and that's well-founded in in history as well as Supreme Court precedent. The thing that we need to know is what I see trending in this discussion. Now, there's some folks out there that would either be really fearful of this process or might use the words constitutional convention in this context. really are self-identifying as those who really don't have adequate knowledge on this process, and really are self-identifying as those folks who really need to go back and do their homework. We tell our kids that scholarship is important. We need to go back and do our own homework on this process that has to do with amending the U.S. Constitution. So we're going to find that it's safe. We're going to find it's safe, and it's something that we need to use. These state legislatures need to realize that they have a duty under the federal Constitution, and it's they're part of the balance of power, and what they'll do will be historic.
And assuming that this would come to pass, so you have this convention, every state gets one vote, you would put forth a number of proposed amendments to the Constitution. Does this convention have the power in and of itself then to amend the Constitution, or would further?
Absolutely not, and that's sometimes what people misunderstand. Once again, folks who come to the discussion and even use the words, well, we don't want to open it all up. They just need to go back and simply read the text of the article. It calls for a convention, which is nothing but a meeting for proposing amendments, and that's what it is. It's an amending convention, and those proposals, John, are really nothing more than the paper they're written on until they're ratified, not by one, but both houses and legislatures across the country in 38 states. So, and it would take 38 states to ratify. Remember, that's both houses and every state. If you count Nebraska, there's just one. It only requires one house or one body in 13 states to stop anything that might be dangerous or what I call a knucklehead proposal. But those proposals are not even going to get that far because they can't be brought up in a convention that has germaneness for a specific topic. And even if they were, they required caucuses in 26 states. If all 50 would show up and be part of that convention, it would require not one member but entire caucuses of 26 states to get it out of the convention. So we think it's we think it's a constitutional way to balance the power and restrain the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. We think it's time, overdue.
He is joining us on the KMOX guest line powered by the Quiver River Electric Cooperative. He is Keith Carmichael, the Missouri Director for the Convention of States Project right here in Missouri. Keith, we've got to take a break. Can you stick around just for a little bit after the break?
Absolutely.
We're going to find out how this process is proceeding throughout the country. We'll find that out next right here on the Voice of St. Louis. Okay. Are you... All right, for those of you keeping score at home, we are visiting with Keith Carmichael, the Missouri Director for the Convention of States Project. He is part of a national group that's attempting to call a convention of states for the purpose of proposing amendments to the United States Constitution. These amendments would take the form of reducing the role and reach of the federal government. Keith was kind enough to stick around during the break. Let's talk about the organization, Keith. You're the Missouri Director for the Convention of States. Do you know how widespread this movement is across the country?
Absolutely. We have some type of leadership in like 49 of the 50 states. We have state directors in nearly all of those. We have sponsors for legislation. I say legislation. They're really resolutions in either one or both houses in nearly 30 states. We're very close to 30. It was 24, 25 just the other day, and we've gained in those. Nearly every day we gain a sponsor in the House or Senate in a state somewhere, and so it is growing. Folks online and well-known folks like Mark Levin, Glenn Beck, Sean Hannity, those folks have got the word out, and it's really, it's moving. We're pretty excited that this year there is a pathway. We're not predicting that it'll happen, but there actually, because of the election that happened in November, there's a pathway for this could happen in 34 states.
Yeah, and 34 is the magic number that is needed here. And clearly this is a conservative movement across the country. If people want to learn more about what you're doing, where can they go?
Conventionofstates.com. Very, very, very simply, conventionofstates.com. All one word there. You can learn about endorsements, learn about the process itself, the plan, and so on. Get involved. We urge folks to come online and build the profile. We have a weekly update. We have a weekly conference call in nearly every, all of these states, but certainly in Missouri, and each one is growing. the thing that I want folks to know that this puts your state legislature, who in the driver's seat. The founders in their brilliance put this country in the hands ultimately, and folks you know very well, your state legislatures, and so that's something that many folks don't understand. They have a duty under the federal Constitution, and how historic would it be? You think about what our country would be like if for 225 years the president had never vetoed a single bill. It would have become irrelevant. We'd have a parliamentary system. Think about what the system would be like if the Senate had rubber-stamped every piece of legislation coming out of the House for 224 or 25 years. And then this year they were going to step up and become part of the balance of power, become relevant in the balance of power. That's ultimately what states have the opportunity to do with this process.
Well, it is a thought-provoking idea. If you want to weigh in on this, 436-7900 is the number to call, 1-800-925-1120. We're visiting with Keith Carmichael, the Missouri Director for the Convention of States Project, and we'd like to take your calls if this is something you want to talk about. Keith, before I let you go, you've been involved in this effort now for just over a year. And once you get your 34th state to ratify this, does it all have to occur in the same year, or can this be something like the other amendment processes in the Constitution where you can just build state upon state upon state for years? Is there a time limit on this?
There's no time limit. These calls will continue. And, of course, a lot of folks look at the unsustainable aspect of the federal government and say, unless we think the demographic and the cultural change trajectories are really moving in the right direction, then this is something we probably should look at doing sooner rather than later.
Have any states adopted a resolution to date?
Absolutely. With this exact operative language, we have Georgia, Florida, and Alaska in the last legislative session, and they did that what I would call preseason. Really without an organization behind them at all. And this is a long-range plan. We want to be there not only to call this convention. Maybe more important than calling this meeting will be selecting the commissioners that go to that meeting. And then the third step, ultimately, we want an organization in every House district in 40 states to help us ratify these proposals one at a time, those that are valid and those that we need.
How serious do you consider the fiscal condition of the United States today?
I think nearly everyone agrees. The GAO, the CBO, even the actuaries for Social Security, they all agree that what we're on is an unsustainable course. No one really knows how far we can go. We keep adding, subtracting, or whatever here as we go. But the word unsustainable really means that our system is due to collapse. We like to use the word unsustainable. That's a nice word. But for children and grandchildren, you just need to look them in the eye and say, are we ready and willing to let this happen on our watch? And I say no.
All right. He is Keith Carmichael. He's the Missouri Director of the Convention of the States. He's been good enough to join us this morning. Thanks so much, Keith. Have a happy new year and good luck with your endeavor.